Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Demai Chapter 6, Halacha 2, Part 3 of the shiur and the final part of the series. And in the Art Scroll, we're on 56b2. Now, in Part 2 of the shiur, we were talking about Kohenim, the rights of tithes, and we were looking at it from the Yisrael perspective, which is that the Yisrael has this right to give the tithes that they're taking out to whichever Kohen they want. Yes, the tithes belong to the tribe of the Kohenim, but which Kohen? And the point is that the Yisrael has the benefit of gratitude, and they can give it to whichever one they want. Why? Maybe they have a neighbor, maybe they have a son-in-law, maybe they have a brother-in-law that's a Kohen. They can give it to whomever they want. And as we were seeing from Rabbi Yochanan, this is a non-sellable thing. Yes, you have an interest in it, but it's non-sellable. Today, we're going to be covering the other case. This is going to be a case where Kohanim have an interest in the tithes. So before, we were talking about where the Yisrael has an interest, a financial interest in a way, on the tithes. In other words, they have this right to give it to whoever they want, and that can be a financial consideration. In other words, if there's a Kohen here in front of you now, and you know that you have a brother-in-law that's a Kohen, you don't need to give it to the Kohen in front of you now. You can designate it for the other Kohen. It just has to go to a Kohen. It belongs to the tribe of the Kohen. You get to pick which one you want. Over here, that is going to be where the Kohen has a financial interest in the tithes. And this is going to be basically, how do you get this, right? This is basically going to be where the Kohen had a field, and they're going to be selling it to Yisrael. But the trick is, the part about this that's a little bit different, is that if the Kohen kept the land and he grew stuff on the land, he would own those tithes. Now that he's selling the land to someone else, he still would have a financial interest in those tithes. And it's not going to be a case where, you could go give this to whichever Kohen you want. This is where the Kohen has a financial interest in the tithes that comes out of that land. That's going to be the point. A little bit different. So basically, we're going to be dealing with land sales, and he's going to try to retain the tithes for himself. And again, this is because he has a financial interest in those particular tithes. If he kept that land and he grew on that for 5 years, he would keep the tithes for himself, no problem. But now if he sells that land to a Yisrael, he's basically, what the law is basically going to be showing, he owns that interest in those tithes. And so we're going to explore that. So the Gemara starts off and it says, if a Kohen sold a field to Yisrael, and he says to them, in other words, he's making it part of the condition of sale, he's making it part of the contract. This is not implied. This is a statement that clings to the title of the land. The Gemara finishes and says, I am selling you this field with a stipulation that the future tithes are to be mine. And the Baraisa says that the tithes are his. So in this case, the Kohen is the seller, and he's retaining for himself the ownership of the tithes that grow in the future upon the land he's selling. Now, generally, you can't exercise ownership over items that didn't come into existence yet. But the Kohen is assumed to have retained for himself a certain degree of ownership over this field where the tithes are going to grow. And yes, these didn't yet come into existence. These tithes didn't come in yet, but they will sprout on the land belonging to the Kohen. And so it will be considered his property when they do come into being. And the Pnei Moshe says, although the Kohen did not stipulate explicitly that he intends to withhold this measure of land for himself, we may presume that was his intention. In other words, since there's no other means by which the tithes may be retained. Now, the Ritva is pointing out in Bavli Baba Batra 63a, which deals with contractual terms, And the Ritva points out that this follows a Talmudic rule that states that where a contract contains an apparently futile clause, it is interpreted in a way that it is not futile. And in this case, what does that mean? The Kohen's words are reinterpreted as referring not to the tithes themselves, but to the land, whose ownership enables him to secure the tithes. So this is implying that the Kohen is setting a condition upon which the sale depends, and that he's saying that the sale should take effect only if he's given the tithes. So there's Rishonim like the Rashba who are explaining that the Kohen is not, or is in fact not making the sale condition of his recipient of the Meiser, but rather he's excluding the Meiser from the sale, and that's the point. It's basically like the Kohen is selling you the field without the tithes that grow on it. And that's basically by this contractual term where it says the tithes will be mine rather than you will give me the tithes. So it's basically like he's selling 90-something% of the land and he's retaining a small portion of it from himself. And basically what this says the Ritva over there from Baba Batra, it emerges that the produce used as tithes on the buyer's portion actually belongs to the seller. And the Rishonim are explaining that it's implicit in the agreement that the seller must allow the buyer to tithe his portion with the seller's produce. So it's really like he has a financial interest in the tithes because it's like he sold most of the land but not all of the land. He retains a financial interest in the land. The Barisa's case is where somebody's selling the field and retains the future tithes. Now, the Gemara is going to shift a little bit, and it's going to ask about retaining the field while selling the tithes. So before, you were selling most of the field and retaining a small part for yourself effectively. It's going to flip it. Now, it's going to sell this small part and retain most of it for the Kohen. So the Gemara asks, and it says, what is the law regarding the Kohen owner selling the future tithes to a Kohen? Basically, they're asking, is that sale going to be valid or not? So in this case, the Kohen landowner does not withhold the tithes, and he's going to sell it to another Kohen, and he's going to retain the field for himself, and basically he's going to sell the future tithes over there. And so the Mara Fulda points out that one could argue in this case that the Kohen perhaps wishes to transfer only the tithes themselves, not the ownership of the land. Now, I want to point out that if this were a Yisrael, this sale would not be permitted. Why? Because it looks like a Kohen who assists on the threshing floor, and that prohibits the sale of tithes to a Kohen. But here, however, the seller is a Kohen or Levi, and the sale is permitted for one Kohen to sell tithes that he himself owns to another Kohen. Now, that's going to basically be a nuance here. This is for a Kohen and not for a Yisrael. Yisrael can't do this kind of transaction. The Gemara is going to talk about this law regarding the Kohen who's going to sell the future tithes to a different Kohen. And the Gemara responds and says, let us learn this law from that which Rabbi Abahu says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, who cited a Brisa and says, if one sells the future tithes of his field to his fellow, he has accomplished nothing. In other words, this sale does not take effect. Very surprising. So Marafulda says, since the tithes have not yet come into existence, they can't be bought or sold. Now, if the owner would include part of the field itself for the sale, that sale would be valid. However, do not presume that this was intention. And basically, he's not selling part of the land. He's basically selling just the future rights. And they're saying that it's invalid. Why? It didn't come into existence yet. So it's going to continue with some other related examples. And it's going to say, if he sells the unborn children of his slave woman, his Canaanite slave woman, to his fellow, he has accomplished nothing. And if he sells fetuses of his animal to his fellow, he has accomplished nothing. And these items have not yet come into being, therefore they can't be sold. And if he sells the airspace of his ruin, in other words, a destroyed building, to his fellow, he's accomplished nothing. Since air is without substance, it can't be sold. So this, says the Rosh Cirilio, is that the airspace of a courtyard doesn't have a substantial presence in the world, and it bears some similarity to items that lack all presence in the world. In other words, items that didn't come into being. Therefore, airspace also can't be bought or sold. Now, the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, rather, one may sell a field to his fellow and retain its future ties for himself. So this is going to be a case where, since the owner retains the ties for himself, we may assume that he intended to withhold whatever is necessary to secure them. And effectively, he's retaining some degree of ownership over the field that allows him to get the ties. That's going to be the difference between this case, right? If the Kohen is selling to Yisrael and he's saying, okay, I'm going to keep the ties, he didn't sell 100% of the land. He's basically retained some interest, and anyway, those future ties would be his property anyway, even if it didn't come into being. And so effectively, it's not like he sold him 100% of the land with the ties. Effectively, there's some degree of ownership over the field, and that's going to let him secure the ties. The Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to say, one may sell a maidservant to his fellow and retain her unborn child for herself. One may sell an animal to his fellow, retain the fetus for herself, and one may sell a rune to his fellow and retain its airspace for himself. And in each of these cases, the item in question can be withheld from the larger sale. And that's going to be the difference between these cases and the cases we just looked at. So although the sale is going to be valid, the item basically remains in the seller's possession in some way. So he's not outright, in the other case, what we just saw with Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, he's outright selling it and then saying, okay, I'm gonna try to keep an interest in it. And what's different about this case is he's basically selling most of it, and he's retaining some degree of ownership over either the slave or the field. Okay, that's going to be the nuance that's going to be different. So if you were looking at it as just a sale, and you were saying, okay, it's just sold, and I'm going to take future ties, that is not the right way to look at it. Basically, the right way to look at it is to say that I'm selling you the most of the field or the field, but I'm retaining some degree of ownership over this, and this degree of ownership is going to let me take the ties. That's going to be the nuance. So in this Baraisa, we see that a sale of future ties does not take effect. That's going to be the Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish view, and the Gemara is going to resolve the inquiry. And the Baraisa ruled that the future ties of a field cannot be sold. The Gemara demonstrates that in some circumstances they can be sold. Gemara starts to look at it with the airspace of the rune. So the Gemara is going to say, but how is it possible for a person to sell the airspace of his rune to his fellow? And it is obvious that something as insubstantial as air cannot be bought or sold. Why does the Baraisa trouble itself to teach this law? By the way, this comes up in Masechet Peah on the deathbed wills. Let's say you have a lot of movable property and you want to transfer that to somebody as an inheritance. Well, there's a way to do it where you buy a spot of land. And by the way, this can be a spot of land that's the size where a pebble can be on it. I mean, it's very, very small. And you're basically saying that the rights of this movable property goes on to this immovable property. So the immovable property is going to be something that gives it substance. And before, we were talking about airspace, which doesn't have substance. So the Gemara says that about this over here in Demai, that you must interpret the Baraisa as alluding to a case where the seller said to the buyer, detach a brick from this rune and acquire the airspace for yourself. In other words, take a piece that's going to be immovable, like this, part of the area that has a brick over here, and that, it's going to be this very small piece of earth over here, and transfer the airspace onto that little tiny piece that takes up the size of a brick, and then you can buy it. Effectively, you're buying this insubstantial thing or this movable product in the case of wine casks together with this immovable property, this permanent property. And so that's going to be where you can make a sale with this. The Gemara is going to conclude by extending this reasoning to the case of the tithes. And how is this going to be similar? The Gemara says, and here too, in the case of one who wishes to sell the future tithes of the field, the land upon which they will grow is before him even now, and regarding which he says to the buyer, uproot a plant from this land to acquire the land so that its tithes will be acquired by you. In other words, if this is done, the sale of the tithes is valid, and one's acquisition of a small part of the land enables the acquisition of future tithes as well. In other words, how is this done? How are you able to retain it? Well, you can do something even very small like uprooting a plant, and the buyer's performing a kinyan on the field in which future tithes would grow. And although the tithes themselves are not yet in existence, just like this airspace is also insubstantial, the land upon which they will grow is in existence, and that can be acquired. So when the tithes sprout, they do so on land belonging to the buyer and are his own property. And there's another way to look at it where, the Gemara can look at it like this. And this is going to be with a commentary by Rabbi Kanievsky. And it's going to be according to this other understanding. The Gemara's inquiry is going to be that the very Kohen who wants to retain tithes for himself, and it can be where the Gemara is looking at the Beraisa that differentiates between selling future tithes and withholding them. And it indicates that whereas one is able to withhold tithes from the sale of a field, he is not able to sell those tithes since it has not yet come into being. That's going to be the difference. And Rabbi Kanievsky points out that the Gemara concludes that where the buyer acquires a degree of ownership in the land, he can acquire the tithes as well. And in this case, the land has been sold and it's not available. Therefore, the tithes also cannot be sold. But according to this interpretation, the Gemara concludes not with a statement but a question, where it says, is the land before him that he might purchase to enable the sale of the tithes or not? Therefore, according to this way, the tithes can't be sold if you did it that way. So the Beur Halacha is going to say like this, that the Yerushalmi agrees with the Bavli that future tithes and other items that didn't come into being cannot be sold. But over here it's going to dispute the Bavli with regard to whether they can be withheld from the sale of the field. And that is the deep point that the Yerushalmi is making. All of these points is basically like you're selling most of the field, but you're withholding part of the field. And according to the Bavli, they can't be withheld, and unless one withholds as well the land upon which they will grow. So that, by the way, is going to be like with the rune with the brick. Like you take a brick-like piece of land and you put the air rights on top of that brick, and that's how it's going to be done. So according to Yerushalmi, the tithes alone can be withheld, even if they're not accompanied by land. But certainly the Yerushalmi would agree that, like the Bavli, you can withhold part of the land and put it on part of the land. That solves the problem and makes it so there's no contradiction between Bavli and Yerushalmi. And over here, the Yerushalmi is going a little bit further and saying that this right actually can be withheld even if it's not accompanied by the land. So there are some ways where if you don't do it right, you don't structure it right, you might not get access to the tithes. The Gemara looks at the Beraisa that we were just talking about regarding the Kohen who sells a field to another while trying to retain the tithes for himself. And the Gemara says that if a Kohen sold a field to a Yisrael and says to him, I am selling you the field with a stipulation that the future tithes are mine, the tithes are his. So the Beraisa continues and gives the next part of the case and says, when he dies, his sons have no ownership in the tithes. They do not inherit this privilege that he withheld for himself. So the Marafulda explains that the Kohen claims the field's future tithes, but he does not specify that they should fall to his heirs after the demise. And this is basically saying that these rights expire after his death and they're not passed on to the heirs. The Gemara continues and says, however, if he stipulates at the sale that the tithes are for me and my sons, or for me and my heirs, he himself has ownership rights in the tithes, and after his death, his sons, says this Gemara, have rights in the tithes, and their heirs have rights in the tithes as well. So, since the Kohen stipulated explicitly that he wishes to reserve the tithes to be passed down to the heirs, and basically this is a transaction where the buyer agreed to this, well, in that case, the heirs also retain the rights after his death, and the ownership of the land makes it possible to secure that land. The Gemara now is going to look at a quote of the Brisa to discuss the law of heirs. And Rabbi Yudan bar Shalom inquired before Rabbi Yosei, until now we know only that this law is stated regarding heirs who are eligible by biblical law. And is the same true of those who are eligible under rabbinic law, but not biblical law? So what is that going to be? The Gemara is going to respond. The law is stated even regarding heirs who are not eligible by biblical law. So this is going to be where the seller is not a Kohen, but a Koheness. In other words, it's going to be a daughter of a Kohen. And the heir is her husband, who, according to some, inherit by rabbinic law only. That's what this is going to be asking. So Gemara goes back to this Brisa and says, if the Kohen seller says, I am selling you this field with a stipulation. So again, this is a female Kohen who inherited the land, and she is making this sale now. And she says that all the tithes are mine for as long as the field is before the buyer, in other words, in the buyer's possession. And then the tithes are the Kohen's only for as long as the field is before the buyer. However, the buyer sold the field to someone else. So now the question is, what do you do with this? Even in the other case where it's going to be a Kohen who sells it to a Yisrael, he retains the rights for himself, and he basically, the Yisrael goes and sells it to a third party. So does the Kohen now have a right to go claim the tithes from this third party? Or does this right disappear, like in a case where, the Kohen only designates it for himself, not his heirs, and then he dies? Is it going to be the same thing? So the Gemara continues, says, however, once the buyer sold the field to someone else, this third party, the Kohen has no further rights in the tithes. And if the original buyer returns and repurchases the field from the second buyer, this is the law. So you have a case where the Kohen and his interest in the tithes gets wiped out, where this Yisrael buyer agrees to the tithes, and now he sells it to a third party. And even now, when the third party sells it back to the Yisrael who originally purchased it, we're going to have an issue here. That's going to be a malokit. So here's the two competing versions of this ruling about the third party now selling this back. So now the question is, are these tithes going to turn back on, that it came into the possession now of this original buyer who is a Yisrael, or is it get shut off and it stays non-transferable? The Gemara says, Rabbi Hiya taught in the Brisa as follows, that the Kohen does not have rights in the tithes. Rabbi Hoshaya taught the Brisa as follows, says the Kohen does have rights in the tithes. So according to Rabbi Hoshaya, the seller stipulated for as long as the field is before the buyer. That means that he does not intend for the rights to be permanently cut off once the field leaves a buyer's hands. Rather, he intends that the tithes and the land that makes their ownership possible remain his. In other words, the Kohen's. It remains with the Kohen whenever the field enters the possession of someone else, even a third party. So even if this ownership is interrupted, it follows that once the buyer repurchases the field, the tithes go back to the original seller. So effectively, what they're saying is that, I'm selling it to you, and Rabbi Hoshaya's point is that, it was sold to this guy, and even if it left possession and came back, this right and condition stays with this Yisrael original buyer, and so those tithes stay in existence. But as we're going to be seeing here, Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Hoshaya disagree as to whether the stipulation of this original seller is going to remain in force after the field has been sold to a third party and then repurchased by the Yisrael who originally made the first purchase. So the Gemara now is going to draw a parallel that's going to be very similar. It's going to look like another topic, but it's actually very similar to what happens with ketubot. So the Gemara is going to look at ketubot to try to understand what to do in this case. What do you do here where you made a contract with this Yisrael person and it left his possession and then it came back? Is he going to get the tithes or not? Does the Kohen get the tithes turned back on or not? The Gemara says the opinions of this dispute between Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Hoshaya correspond to the opinions of those from the other dispute. And we learned in the Mishnah over there in Masechet Ketubot. This, by the way, is in the Yerushalmi 9:10, Bavli 89b. And it says, if someone divorces his wife and then remarries her, but he did not write a new ketubah for the second marriage, the Mishnah there says it may be assumed that he remarried her on the basis and conditions of the first ketubah. In other words, upon the divorce and then the reacquisition of this woman, there's no ketubah. Basically, it's assumed that you use the original ketubah. It's like implied that the man was okay with the original condition with it. And so it's implied that he accepted it. He didn't write a new ketubah with new conditions. So the Gemara is going to cite a dispute regarding that ruling. Rabbi Hanan taught before Rabbi La. Two Amorim express different opinions on that Mishnah's ruling. The Gemara says, one says that the ruling applies with regard to the basic ketubah payment, but not with regard to extra stipulations. So, in other words, if there's going to be a bunch of extra stipulations in the ketubah, and in there is also going to be the amount that on the death, or if in a case of a divorce, on how much the ketubah payment would be, basically one Amora is saying that he accepts the ketubah payment that was in the original first ketubah, but not the other stipulations. And the other one is going to be saying, says this Gemara, that it applies both with regard to the basic ketubah payment that's in the original ketubah and with regard to extra stipulations that was in the original ketubah. So these Amorim are disagreeing regarding the status of these additional stipulations. And when a husband remarries his wife on the basis of the first ketubah, are these extra stipulations going to be there or not? So what could these extra stipulations be? Well, it could be a promise from the husband to support the wife's daughter from another man for a period of, say, 5 years. That's a case that comes up in Bavli Ketubot 101b. So that would be where, this guy acquires the wife in the first place, and it's for a certain amount of money, fine. And then they're also saying, but also while they're married, they're gonna, he's gonna give financial support to the Kala's daughter for 5 years. And so they get divorced, and then he reacquires her 6 months later. Question is, does he still have to pay, child support for, say, this extra 4.5 years? So that's going to be the question. So the Gemara is going to demonstrate a parallel between this dispute, because this ketubah right, like, having to do the child support from another marriage that you agreed upon in this ketubah, this is very much like the Kohen who makes a stipulation that he gets the tithes to this new seller. So the Gemara says the one who says that the ruling applies with regard to the basic ketubah payment, but not with regard to the extra stipulations, holds that the Kohen does not have rights in the tithes that were sold and then repurchased. And the Gemara says, the one who says that the ruling applies both with regard to the basic ketubah payment and with regard to the extra stipulations holds that the Kohen does have rights in the tithes that are sold and then repurchased. So the Gemara is going to continue with Rabbi Chia's version of the Brisa and return, that the return of the field to the original buyer does not restore the Kohen's claims to the tithes. And the Gemara is going to challenge this view on the basis of a Brisa. It's going to teach another Brisa. The Gemara said they taught in a Brisa, if a Yisrael leases the field as a sharecropper from a Koheness, in other words, the daughter of a Kohen, the tithes and the truma are hers, since she is eligible to receive the truma. The Yisrael sharecropper is assumed to have relinquished all rights in the tithes. So in this case, we are learning that in the Mishnah that's going to be coming up in Halacha 3, that a Kohen landowner leases a field to a Yisrael sharecropper, and it's going to be presumed that the Yisrael cedes the tithing privileges to the Kohen, who intends to reserve for himself the truma of his own field. And the Bryce is teaching the same applies with regard to a bat Kohen, a Koheness, who is also presumed to have this intention to reserve herself the truma of their own field. So a Koheness's eligibility to receive gifts from the Kohanim, though, that's a matter of Maloket Tanayim. And this Brisa is evidently in the opinion that the Koheness can get these gifts. So the Gemara is going to continue and say that if the Koheness married a Yisrael, which renders her ineligible for Truma, that's, by the way, a rule. If you have a Bat Kohen, she marries a Yisrael, well, she, as long as she stays married, doesn't get to eat the tithes anymore. If she gets divorced, she does get to go back and eat the tithes. She goes back to her father's house. So if the Koheness marries a Yisrael, says this Gemara, which renders her ineligible for Truma, she and the sharecropper divide the tithes. The Gemara says if she was subsequently widowed or divorced from the Yisrael, she returns to her original status where she can eat the tithes. Since she again is eligible for Truma, she may claim all of that as the tithes. So over here, a Koheness who marries a Yisrael by halacha is deemed to be a Yisrael, and she's not eligible for tithes. But over here, her law is like that of any other Yisrael who share crops in the field of a Yisrael. The tithes are going to be divided between them. That's the law. If this Yisrael and that Yisrael are doing something where they're sharecropping, they split the tithes. So the Gemara is going to continue. And although the Koheness's claim to the tithes ended when she marries the Yisrael, they are regained upon her divorce. That's the point of this Baraisa. And this looks like it contradicts Rabbi Chia. And basically Rabbi Chia is saying that the buyer sells the field, repurchases it. The seller does not regain the tithes. So the Gemara is going to differentiate between the case of the Koheness and Rabbi Chia's case, and we're going to be finishing this up very soon. The Gemara differentiates this between these two cases. And here in Rabbi Chia's Baraisa, the cases where the Kohen sold the field and removed it from his possession. And that's going to be a case where his sole remaining connection to the field was his rights to the tithes, and that ends when the buyer sells the field to someone else. And at that point, the Kohen retains no connection to the field at all, and therefore his privilege does not get restored when the field is repurchased. The Gemara says here, however, regarding a Koheness, the case is one where one merely leased the field from the Koheness. In other words, there's not a purchase. And so since the field never left the Bat Kohen's possession, her right to the tithes is never lost. And so even if there's a temporary suspension because of her marriage to a Yisrael, once the marriage ends, her privilege is restored and her ownership of the land is still there. It's just a lease. It's not a permanent sale. In the other case, it was a permanent sale. The Gemara is going to reject this, though. And the Gemara is going to say, but Rabbi Chia himself taught a different version of the Baraisa concerning a Bat Kohen as follows. It says, if a Bat Kohen sold the field to Yisrael, the tithes are hers. According to Rabbi Chia, the Barisa's case is not where the Koheness is leasing the field to Yisrael, but where she sells it to him. And basically, this Barisa is ruling that if the Koheness is widowed or divorced after the marriage of a Yisrael, the tithes are again hers. And we see that even where the field did leave the Koheness's possession, her rights to the tithes from that transaction are restored once that marriage ends. And that's going to be the question. So the Gemara is going to, again, try to differentiate between the case of the Koheness and that of Rabbi Hia. And Rabbi Shmuel bar Avduma says, there, in Rabbi Hia's case, the field left the possession of both of them. In other words, both the Kohen and the buyer. And since the Kohen's connection to the field was entirely severed, his rights are not restored when the buyer repurchases a field from the third party. Why? Because it's a complete severance of the field. The rights are completely severed. Here, however, in the case of a bat Kohen, the field left the possession of the seller, that's going to be the bat Kohen, but did not leave the possession of the buyer. So over here, the Koheness does retain some connection to the field. And basically, in this case, if the marriage to the Yisrael ends, her claim to the tithes is restored. So I want to point out that one of the differences in these cases is going to be like this, that the bat Kohen sells the land and the rights to the tithes to a Yisrael. And she goes and marries a different Yisrael. And this Yisrael who bought the land doesn't sell it to a third party. Now, after a divorce, the bat Kohen comes back and says, look, the rights of this land have not been severed. I just have merely had a suspension. I just had a temporary suspension of this rights. The tithes are mine. That's basically what it's saying. But in the other case, where the Kohen sells it to the second party, who's a Yisrael, and the Yisrael sells it to another Yisrael, and then this other Yisrael sells it back to the original second buyer, they're saying that this is a complete severance, and that there's a total severance of the rights, and it doesn't turn back on. The Gemara is going to give another Baraisa regarding a Kohen who sells a field while retaining the rights to the tithes. And we're going to be finishing this up. It says, if a Kohen sold a field to a Yisrael, and he says to him that the sale is made with the stipulation that the field's future tithes are to be his, in other words, the Kohen's, and he's saying for 4 or 5 years. So he's making a condition. He says, I'm selling you this field, but the tithes are mine for 4 or 5 years. The Kohen is able to block the Yisrael from insisting that he not plant the field with a vineyard, or sow it with woad, or not make it a field of reeds. So in a field of a vineyard, that's going to be where you have orlah. So you can't use the crop for, 3 years, 4 years, and then you have to bring the crop over in the 4th year. You don't get the value of the crop for part of this time. So if you made a 5-year stipulation, the guy says, okay, I'm going to plant a vineyard, and now you have orlah for 3 of those years, and then you have the 4th year, you have to bring the first fruits, things like that. Well, you have a case where you've blocked part of the time of the use of this. Now, what about woad? Woad is going to be used for dye, and that's not harvested during the first 4 or 5 years of growth. Why? Because you're trying to let the roots grow, and that's going to be what you're using in the plant. And so then there's no tithing time at all. Basically, woad is not a food, and it's exempt from tithes. It's also exempt from Shvius sanctity. And what's going to happen over there is that it's going to be where it's going to take more than 5 years for the roots to grow so you can turn it into dye. And now you get no tithes. In the other case of the vineyard, you are unable to use it for part of the time. Now you're unable to use it all of the time. And reeds are just not food, and they're not subject to tithes. What do you do with reeds? You can use it to make roofing, and you can also use it for firewood, but there's no tithes for that. The Brisa continues, says, if, however, the Kohen says, the tithes are to be mine forever, he is not able to block the Yisrael from insisting that he not plant the field with a vineyard, that he not sow it with woad, or that he not make it a field of reeds. Why? In this case, the Yisrael may plant the field with a crop of his choice, even though it prevents the Kohen from retrieving tithes. Why would it be? Well, when the tithes are to be the Kohen's forever, the Yisrael's planting of those crops do not deny the Kohen of tithes, because maybe he'll do a different crop in the future. And, if we allow the Kohen to veto the crop in this case, he'll be able to permanently block the Yisrael from using the field as he wishes, and there'll never be a time when the Yisrael will be able to plant the crop of his choice. So maybe he wants to use woad for 7 years and then go over to wheat. Well, he needs woad for some reason. Fine. But over here, the case over here is going to be where the Yisrael effectively is always going to be able to get vetoed if he wants to do it for a short period of time for something else. That's going to be the point. The Bryce is going to continue and say, if, however, is going to give a different incident, related incident. The Gemara says an incident came before Rabbi Acha bar Ula, in which a Kohen seller stipulated that the tithes should be his forever, and the buyer then plants reeds. And Rabbi Acha bar Ula required the buyer to give the seller 1/10 of the reeds. In other words, Mara Fulda is going to say like this: Rabbi Acha bar Ula did not accept the ruling of this last brisa. And his view, even if the Kohen says that the tithes are to be his forever, he can prevent the Yisrael from planting crops that will not yield a tithe. In Rabbi Acha's case, the Yisrael defied the Kohen and plants reeds despite the protest. And Rabbi Acha ruled that he has to turn over 1/10 of the reeds to the Kohen as a penalty for this act. And the Gemara is going to be finishing up. And the Gemara cites a brisa that is the reverse of the earlier one. In this case, the Yisrael is the seller and the Kohen is the buyer. So the Gemara says, if Yisrael sold a field to a Kohen, and he says to him, so now we're doing the opposite cases here, that the sale is made with a stipulation that the future's tithes are to be his, the Yisrael's, for 4 or 5 years. It is permitted. Why is that? So in this case, the Yisrael makes the sale conditional upon the Kohen transferring to the Yisrael whatever truma he separates from the fields of the crop over for the next 4 or 5 years. And the Kohen transfers not merely the rights to choose the truma's recipient, that's going to be the benefit of gratitude that we were talking yesterday in part 2 of the shiur, but the truma itself, which becomes the Yisrael's property and does not need to be distributed to the Kohen. So the Yisrael may not use the truma himself, but he may sell it to other Kohanim, or he can keep the proceeds. And should the Kohen fail to deliver the truma to the Yisrael, this sale would be invalidated. So the Chazan Ish points out in Demai 14:12, that's from his book, that the brisa rules that this is permitted for the truma. The Kohen separates from his own property, which he is free to distribute to whomever he chooses. So the Gemara is going to make a condition on that, though. It's going to say, but if he says that the tithes are to be the Yisrael's forever, it is prohibited, for a Kohen may not make a Yisrael into a Kohen by designating him a permanent recipient of Truma. So basically, the Vilna Goan says about this, by agreeing to give the Truma to the Yisrael on a permanent basis, the Kohen makes it look like, with the Morris Ein problem, that one can ascend to the position of a Kohen through mere appointment. And this degrades the institution of the kahuna. And so because of that, this sale is going to be prohibited. The Bryce is going to finish up with a similar case. If a Kohen sold a field to Yisrael and he says to him, I am selling you the field with a stipulation that the field's future tithes are to be yours. Basically, he's saying that the Yisrael buyer gets to keep the tithes. The Kohen is selling to a Yisrael buyer. And he's saying that the Yisrael buyer gets to keep the tithes for 4 or 5 years. It is prohibited. And the Chazan Ish comments about that. In this case, the Kohen makes the sale conditional on the Yisrael separating the truma of the field, and then instead of giving it to a Kohen, keeps it for himself. And the Gemara is going to explain why that is not allowed. The Gemara gives an apparent contradiction between the Bryce's 2 clauses. It says here, where the buyer is the Kohen, you say that it is permitted to grant the Yisrael the tithes for a few years. But here, where the seller is a Kohen, you say it is prohibited to grant the Yisrael the title of the tithes. What's going to be the difference? And the Gemara replies and finishes up and says, here, where the Kohen brought the field, he granted the Yisrael something that was in his possession, and it's in his power to give. In other words, the Kohen is the owner of the field and the one who separates the truma, and therefore the owner is his property, and he's free to transfer it to the Yisrael. And this is entirely permissible as long as it is not done on a forever basis. But the Gemara says here, however, where the Kohen sold the field, he granted the Yisrael something that was not in his possession. In other words, it was not in his power to give, and the tithes are therefore not the Yisrael's property, and therefore he's not allowed to keep them. In other words, in this case, the Kohen owns neither the field nor the truma, and rather the truma is separated by the new owner of the field. That's going to be the Yisrael, who's obligated to distribute it to a Kohen. And the Bryce is ruling that since the Kohen seller does not own the truma, he's powerless to transfer it to the Yisrael. And the Vilna Goan says the Yisrael is therefore prohibited to keep this truma. By doing so, by keeping it, the Yisrael is neglecting his obligation to distribute it to the tribe of the Kohanim. And why is this in here? The Chazan Ish points out in 14:12, without this Bryce's ruling, one might assume that we would invoke this rule about the rabbis treating one who did not acquire like one who did acquire. And that allows us in some situations to treat a Kohen who did not acquire a particular gift of the Kohanim as if he did acquire. And in this case, this would allow us to view the Kohen who never actually received the Truma as having received it from the Yisrael and then returned it to the Yisrael. And in that case, the Yisrael will be permitted to keep it. And the Chazan Ish points out that the Bryce is informing us, in fact, this rule does not apply. That's the point. And therefore, the Yisrael is not allowed to keep the Truma. Mara Fulda finishes this up and said, had the Kohen withheld the Truma for himself, the law would have been different. And in that case, the Truma would have been the property of the Kohen, and he would be free to distribute it to whomever he wanted. But in this case, he does not withhold the Truma for himself. That's what we were talking about in the beginning of this shiur, where the Kohen withholds the Truma for himself. And in these cases, the Kohen didn't withhold the Truma for himself, and he's simply attempting to make a gift of it to the Yisrael without ever taking possession of it. And therefore, because he never actually took possession of it, the Kohen can't do it. Have a great day.